An extraordinary event in American history has a 100th anniversary this month. That event was the passage of the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to vote in federal elections. Failure is impossible were the last words spoken in public by Susan B. Anthony. She insisted that no other right was as important as the vote. She said these words often and in many speeches because her entire life was spent doing suffrage work. What many people don't know is how long and painful and difficult this task was. My own granddaughter, who certainly is clear on the fact that women did not always have the vote, had no idea what it took on the part of hundreds of thousands of both women and men to get the vote for women. The campaign for women's rights had been going on for years with little success, but it was the notice in a local newspaper in her hometown of Rochester, New York, that finally pushed Anthony over the top and proved too irresistible for her not to respond to. The notice in bold letters and on the front page said, "Register now. Today and tomorrow are the only remaining opportunities to register to vote. If you were not permitted to vote, you would fight for that right, undergo all privations for it, face death for it. So register now. Do not wait any longer." What the notice did not say was, and by the way, you must be a male to register to vote. So Susan B. Anthony rounded up one of her sisters and a close friend and set out for the 1st District of Rochester's 8th Ward to register to vote. Just imagine the scene. 3 formidable, older-age ladies from noted Rochester families dropping the gauntlet of history into the laps of startled young election officials. When Anthony asked to have her name entered into the rolls, one of the registrars, Beverly Jones, at first refused. "I told Anthony that the Constitution of the state of New York only gave the right to vote to men," Jones later testified. "Anthony asked me if I was acquainted with the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. I told her I was. She wanted to know if under that, which allows all citizens to vote, she could still vote, and Jones said, 'Yes, I believe you are eligible.'" By the end of the registration period, 2 days later, women in 8 of Rochester's 10 wards, a total of 14 women, had followed Anthony's lead. Now here's what is interesting. Exactly half of them were Quakers, and the other half were Unitarians. Why were other faith-based groups not represented? Where were the Baptists, the Methodists, or even the Congregationalists? Even later, as many more people joined the suffrage bandwagon, these groups were absent. Though convinced of her rights, Anthony was smart. She still sought legal advice. The only member of the bar who even considered Anthony's request was Henry Selden. He told her, after reviewing the various cases, that her claim for a right to vote under the 14th Amendment was valid. And with that, Susan B. Anthony not only registered, but voted. She voted for Ulysses S. Grant for President of the United States, along with 4 other Republicans for other offices. And she voted for Republicans because they were the only political party that acknowledged any rights for women. She immediately dashed off a letter to her good friend Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in which she wrote, "Well, I have gone and done it. I have just voted the straight Republican ticket at 7 o'clock this morning. The Honorable Henry Selden will be my counsel. He has read up on the law and all of our arguments, and is satisfied that we are in the right. So we are probably in for fine agitation here in Rochester." Although raised a Quaker, Anthony had joined and attended the Unitarian Church in Rochester from the age of 30 on. And her father was an anti-slavery lawyer who preached social justice. She herself was a committed reformer. first for temperance and then for abolition. But in the suffrage wars, Susan B. Anthony was the general. She believed in universal suffrage for all people, and she believed it was the most important legal right any human being could have. And most of the women and men she aligned herself with, indeed most people supporting votes for women at that time, were either Quakers or Unitarians. They were the only faith-based groups seeking fairness and justice for all Americans. The events that transpired over the next 7 months reveal not only the grueling task faced by suffragists, but the deep hostility of the federal government, which, as one activist described it, had pursued these 14 women and the hundreds that followed them with a vengeance. On November 12, 1872, Susan B. Anthony was arrested in her home based on a complaint by a poll watcher for voting in a federal election. It was a very serious offense, carrying a penalty of 20 years jail time. Here are Anthony's words about what happened next, and I'm reading now from her journal. A young man in a beaver hat and kid gloves came to see me. He sat down in my living room. He said, "Wasn't it pleasant weather?" And I agreed that it was. He hemmed and he hawed and finally said that a U.S. commissioner, a William Storrs, wanted to see me. "Well, where is he?" I said. "And what for?" I asked. "To arrest you," he said. "Is this the way you arrest men?" I asked. "No," he admitted. Then I said, "Well, I demand that I be arrested properly." And I held out my hands for handcuffs to be put on them. He declined. He said he could not do it. He left, but he came back the next day. At the end, all 14 women who had voted were arrested, and they were released, however, in a few days. Susan B. Anthony was indicted by a grand jury for knowingly, wrongfully, and unlawfully voting in a federal election without having a right to do so. Her crime? Gender. She was a person of the female sex. She pleaded not guilty and was fined $1,000 bail. She refused to pay the bail, so her lawyer, Henry Selden, paid it himself. Her hope was that her case would go to the Supreme Court, but that never happened. Her trial was scheduled for May, and she was put in the custody of a federal marshal, the same unfortunate soul who had come to her house in the beaver hat and the kid gloves earlier. At one point, while the lawyers were trying to schedule a date for her arguments, she interrupted to say she had a speaking engagement in Ohio on that date and could not be there. The marshal protested against her being absent, but she would not back down. She continued to maintain a full calendar of speeches, meetings, travel, and, as she put it, general agitation. Sometimes she turned her ordeal into entertainment. In New York City, she gave the incidents of her arrest and trial to an immense audience, moving them alternately between laughter and anger. When she spoke, she deconstructed the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation to prove that women as citizens have a constitutional right to vote. She did, however, endure much abuse in many places where she spoke, as she was often pelted with everything from beer bottles and stones to rotting fruit. Twice she was knocked over while police officers stood by and did not stop the offenses or help her in any way. Presiding over her case was Judge Ward J. Hunt, a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. With remarkable forethought, Hunt had put in writing his decision about the case before even hearing it. The cross-examination by Henry Selden went this way. Question: You say there was a defect in Anthony's character. What was the defect of her character? Answer: She was not a male citizen. Question: Her defect was that she was a woman? Answer: Yes, Your Honor. Well, that defect also prohibited her from testifying on her own behalf. Women were not allowed to testify. Anthony's lawyer addressed the larger issue of feminism in a stirring defense which lasted 3 hours. He cited her rights under the 14th Amendment. He ended by saying that having voted in good faith, she was guilty of no crime. The following day, the prosecutor delivered a 2-hour legal argument in which he said that the framers of the 14th Amendment did not, in framing it, thereby confer the right to vote upon females. Well, as Judge Hunt began to pronounce her sentence, the sentence for Anthony's crime of voting, he stopped to ask if the prisoner had anything she wanted to say. Susan B. Anthony stood up and gave the speech of her life. "Yes, Your Honor, I have many things to say," she began. "In your ordered verdict of guilty, you have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored." And she went on, but I won't go on, don't worry. Anthony was eloquent in her defense, triumphant in her defeat. When she was done, the judge found her guilty and ordered her to pay $100 in costs. Susan B. Anthony refused. The Albany Law Journal, which was the journal of the very highly respected Albany Law School, put it this way: Miss Anthony had no trial by jury. In effect, she was only a trial by Judge Hunt. This is not what the Constitution guarantees, but Anthony made the most of it. She wrote up and had published her account of the trial. She wore her conviction like a badge of honor and made the story of what happened to her a regular feature on the suffrage speaking circuit. The 3 inspectors who allowed her to vote were imprisoned later. The ladies of Rochester treated them all to a sumptuous jailhouse dinner. Anthony asked President Grant to pardon them, which he did immediately. And the suffrage women celebrated with a grand reception and then set their sights on a federal amendment of which would be their own. It would take 46 years, but it finally came, was ratified, and signed into law in 1920. Had Susan B. Anthony been born 30 years later, things might have turned out differently in her case. By the turn of the century, which had changed in the world for women, young women had put their collective feet down, and older women would eventually follow. Women were no longer willing to wear long skirts which dragged in the mud. They refused to have chaperones follow them everywhere they went. Colleges and universities were now accepting women. More women were attending and graduating from them. Arranged marriages were so unpopular that only 2 in the whole country were recorded in 1902. Sports for women were completely acceptable now. Popular novels encouraged a search for meaning in women's lives. And instead of planning costume balls, one of which actually cost $6 million in today's money, they were doing more constructive work. Many women were doing welfare work, which put them in close touch with women whose lives were very different from their own, and helped them understand why women needed the vote. It seemed to take forever, getting the vote for women. It did take forever, but it finally happened, 100 years ago this month. And this is indeed worth celebrating.